How can we ensure that trade on the global stage is profitable, equitable, and most importantly, sustainable? Hello from the World Economic Forum in Geneva, Switzerland. I'm Adrian Monk. During today's Agenda Dialogue, we'll try to answer this crucial question with thought leaders and decision makers in global trade. Our speakers today, Director General of the World Trade Organization, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. From India, we have Piyush Goyal, Minister of Railways, Commerce and Industry, as well as Consumer Affairs, Food and Public Distribution. Hennadi Al-Saleh is the chair of the board of directors at Agility, a global logistics company, and Kiti Bose is co-founder and CEO of Zalingo, a fashion e-commerce platform. We're joined by an expert in international trade, economist Richard Baldwin, and finally Dan Tehan, Australia's Minister of Trade, Tourism and Investment. We're excited to have them with us. Leading our discussion today is the President of the World Economic Forum, Borge Brende.
Thank you so much, Adrian, and welcome to our distinguished contributors this time. We're very honored to have the newly elected Director General of the WTO, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, with us. Ngozi, great to see you and congratulations. First woman Director General of WTO, but Ngozi also has a great career as Finance Minister of Nigeria with the World Bank. And if anyone were able to get trade negotiations back on track, it would be Ngozi. We know that we are still not out of the woods. Of course, we do expect quite substantial economic growth this year, and some countries might even reach a pre-COVID level at the end of the year. Big economies like the G2, China and the US, but we know that many emerging economies are now struggling. We're struggling also here in Europe, even if we see that the COVID level is going down a bit. We are all thinking about the situation in India, and we're very honored that Minister Goyal could also join us under these difficult circumstances. What we're also seeing is that there will be no real economic recovery without the trade recovery. And I would like, Ngozi, to start with the macro picture that I just shared. And I know as a leading economist, you probably are also worried that the light in the end of the tunnel hopefully is not an approaching train, but that we are seeing really some strength in the economy. And we also know that, for example, FDIs have plummeted with 42% this year in emerging economies and developing economies. So it's a challenging outlook, and how also to create the trade recovery. Over to you. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Borge, and nice to be with all of you on this panel. Yes, I think you captured it well. What you mentioned about the recovery of the economy and how sustainable this is. Also, we mirror that on the trade front. As you know, trade decreased by about 5.3%, contracted by 5.3% in volume terms last year, and 7% in value terms. And we're seeing a rebound this year of about 8%. But that rebound, we have to dig behind it and see that there's quite a bit of divergence. Just as we see in the growth or recovery of the world economy, we see the same in trade. There's a very strong recovery in Asia, North America. Europe, as you said, is a bit of a mixed picture, but also recovering. But when you look at Latin America and Africa, those regions are falling behind. So you see a divergence in the pace of recovery. And I think this is something that has to be addressed. Interestingly, if we were able to get our vaccine distribution right for the world, we could see an additional 2% bounce in the in trade recovery globally. We could go from 8 to 10%. That's what our numbers are showing. So vaccine policy is economic policy. And that's one thing we're trying to say, that we need to get that right if we want a sustained recovery of the global economy.
No, thank you so much. And just to have a short follow-up question on the vaccines at the beginning, because I think there is only a health remedy that can really get us out of this crisis. COVID anywhere is COVID everywhere. The Biden administration now announced that they were also willing to lift the patent. We know also that equitable access to vaccines is so important. What can the WTO and under your leadership contribute with in this context?
Well, thank you. I think the WTO trade and WTO have a strong role to play in the issue of the pandemic. And, you know, I think the conversation tends to talk only about the TRIPS waiver and limit it to that. But for me, that's really not the case. I think the TRIPS waiver and transfer of technology and know-how, it's just one part of what needs to be done. But there are three aspects that need to come together in order for us to be able to make vaccine access equitable, increase the volume, and distribute to all the people who need it. I think the first part is on export restrictions, prohibitions, you know, both explicit and implicit, because there are some countries who have these restrictions who have not, they have not formally declared them to the WTO through our monitoring system. But of what we know, we had 109 restrictions at the beginning of the pandemic, and it's now down to 51. But unless we continue to lower this is inhibiting to the supply chain. And so we need to work on that, and that's definitely a place where trade can contribute. As you know, we have one company, Pfizer-BioNTech, telling us that their supply chain is made up of 280, their vaccine to be produced, 280 components manufactured at 86 sites in 19 countries. That's a pretty sophisticated supply chain. And if we don't take care to make sure that flows, that's a problem. So that's one place where trade and WTO members can contribute. The second aspect is that what we're experiencing in the world now is a tremendous scarcity of supply. And we have to deal with this volume issue. And the point is, we need to bring into production any existing sites that are not being used now. And so we had, last month, I asked vaccine manufacturers for a meeting at the WTO along with members, civil society, research and development. And we had a great meeting. And in there, we discovered that there are certain emerging markets and developing countries that have capacity that can be turned around in the short term. When I say short term, of course, for vaccines, for instance, short term is 6 to 9 months, not overnight. But that's still a short time. We have Bangladesh, Pakistan, we have even in India itself, we have Indonesia, we have Senegal, we have South Africa. These countries let us know they have some capacity that with some little investment could be turned around to augment production. As you know, production and exports are concentrated in the world in a way that is not very helpful. 80% of exports come from 10 countries. And we're seeing what this means when you have a pandemic or the type of situation we have in India, where it's politically very difficult for government to be exporting vaccines. We should actually praise India for having exported 40% or more, but now they can't. So we need to distribute manufacturing better around the world, and then we need to increase production. Let me just give you one statistic. It's anomalous that a continent like Africa with 1.3 billion people imports 99% of the vaccines it uses and 90% of its pharmaceuticals. So this is not really a balanced outlook. So we have to work on the production side, on the manufacturing scaling up. The third aspect is the technology, transfer of technology and know-how, and the IP waiver. And there we are waiting for our members to come to the table and negotiate a good outcome, which will allow developing countries, almost what I would say elasticity in access, whilst at the same time incentivizing research and production. I know it can be done. The pronouncement by the US about the TRIPS waiver and also by New Zealand and the willingness of the EU to come to the table gives a fillip to the effort to try and bring members to the table. Of course, as DG, I cannot take sides with one or the other. My job is to make sure our members come to the table and actually negotiate. So far, they've just been reading statements in a formal setting of the TRIPS Council, and they've not sat at the table. So hopefully we will do that, and we'll come with a pragmatic arrangement that is satisfactory to all members. So those three aspects are needed for us to really get vaccines to people and into arms.
Well, thank you for that very important message, and also thank you for underlining the importance of the global value chains. And they should not stop. But I think in the future, as you alluded to, we have to build more resilient global value chains also to meet this kind of crisis. We know that you're starting your career with the ministerial meeting here in Geneva in December, MC12. We know there is a growing consensus around looking at the big tech companies and other ways to agree on some guidelines. We also know there is a big discussion around reforming the dispute settlement mechanism that is so important for the WTO. And we know there are also other discussions going on related to investment facilitation and etc. So what do you think we can achieve if we get together and get the right of spirit now in the run-up to MC12?
Well, thank you. I think it's really critical that we have some deliverables at MC12. I've been talking to a lot of leaders now, including yesterday in Rome with Prime Minister Mario Draghi, the chair of the G20. And there's a very clear message that the WTO needs to have some successes this year. I think no longer can we take 20 years to negotiate outcomes on very important things. If the WTO is about people, the purpose of the WTO in the Marrakesh preamble says it's about enhancing people's living standards. It's about creating employment. It's about supporting sustainable development. If you look at this, that was done in 1995, it's as valid today, and it's all about people. If we are all about people, we can't afford to take this kind of time. Therefore, we have to focus on having successes. Now, there are 3 or 4 things I think we should look at for MC12, and I'm very glad to see Minister Piyush Goyal right there with us. Trade ministers need to focus on some deliverables. So here are some. I think for the issue of sustainability and the environment, we are hoping that the fisheries subsidies negotiations, which is designed to eliminate harmful fisheries subsidies, will come to fruition. This is good for sustainability. It's the delivery of SDG 14.6. And it's been going on, the negotiations have been going on for 20 years. My hope we conclude that and deliver that. Actually, I've asked for a ministerial conference in July for us to take stock of where we are with this, but there's some hope we can get this done. Secondly, trade and health. We just talked now about the vaccines. The WTO has shown that it is relevant to today's problems and can play a very strong part in helping solve the issue of the pandemic and other issues of the global commons. So I'm hoping that we will have a framework, to guide our contribution to the solutions of the pandemic, with action similar to what I spelled out earlier, so I don't go into that again, but also putting in a framework to deal with future pandemics. So we mustn't just think of how do we deal with what we have before us, but how is trade going to be contributory to the solution of future pandemics? Then I think that a third deliverable we need to look at has to do with with agriculture. Many of our members have said that an MC12 without an agreement on agriculture will not work for them. So we also need to look at agriculture from the lens of this pandemic. We've seen we have food security-ish problems. So how can we deliver for food security at MC12? Because it helps to take care of some of the issues on food supplies during the pandemic. And then the fourth deliverable, I think, is on the dispute settlement system that you referred to, Borja. Without this, I think the credibility of the WTO in terms of making new rules will be undermined. So we need to have some agreement, even if it's a basic understanding of what reforms we want to do to the dispute settlement system. We need to have that for MC12. And then finally, there's a set of issues that are being discussed under what we call the joint statement initiatives. These are the cutting edge issues. Of course, some of our members have some issues. For example, India and South Africa have raised issues about the legality of the joint statement initiatives, but they are going on now. They have garnered a lot of support from members, and I'll just name 2 or 3 that might be having, members might be bringing some outcomes at MC12. One is services domestic regulation to deal with the services area. Another is e-commerce, you mentioned, and digital, which is actually very, very important. We have no rules underpinning e-commerce now, and that is anomalous for the WTO. We also want to deal with inclusion. I mean, trade has lifted up along with along with globalization, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But some people have been left behind. Poor people within rich countries, but also poorer nations that have been left behind. What can the multilateral trading system contribute to inclusion? And we're looking at the discussions on MISMIS, micro, medium, and small enterprises, how to get them on national, regional, and global value chains. Women in trade, very exciting. Some possibilities there on what we can do with inclusion. So that's also going on. And finally, trade and climate. There are discussions going on now on how the trade can contribute better to environmental goods and services. Can we revive the negotiations that were going on in that area previously that stalled in 2016? What more can we do to contribute? And there's also the circular economy discussions going on plastics. So quite a lot of exciting things happening at the WTO. And I think making MC12 support these exciting endeavors we're on now and actually deliver some success. That's what we're hoping for.
No, thank you so much. And also thank you for underlining the importance of inclusion and reminding us all that comparative advantages in trade also has brought hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty, but we also have to seriously address some of the challenges. And also what you said now about breaking the impasse, not only thinking the single undertaking. Since 2001 in Doha, we really haven't broken the impasse because we didn't want to do that much of early harvest. And what you're now saying, I understand, you're willing to do all possible early harvest to get things back on track in WTO, and also follow up possibly then on COP26 that's happening in Glasgow in November. And you see a role also for the WTO when it comes to green trade. That's my understanding.
Absolutely, Borg. I see a role. And in fairness to the WTO, actually, these discussions had started earlier on, and there was almost agreement on environmental goods and services. How do we incentivize renewables, for instance, trade in renewables? And we see it's getting cheaper and cheaper. Trade also has had a role to play in that. So we hope we could revive these discussions and contribute very directly. We have a role to play. For me, it's a very exciting area.
No, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for this insight. Thank you for your leadership throughout decades. We're so happy to see an African leader and a woman at head of the WTO, because it also sends a signal that trade is about inclusion, is about jobs, and it also has to be about development. Really delivering on what was the spirit behind the Doha Development Round in 2001. We will see more of you in the coming year. I think this is a nice segue over to Minister Goyal, Minister of India for Trade, Commerce, Railways. Minister Goyal, we're so pleased to see you here. We, at the beginning, also send our warmest wishes and our solidarity to your country. We know that you're struggling with a terrible second wave of COVID. So we really, really appreciate that you're taking your time to be with us today. Your leadership, but also your friendship means a lot. And we know in the WTO context, India is crucial. What you're thinking about today is, of course, what can we contribute with as the world when it comes to the current situation in India. Of course, you're getting no more oxygen, ventilators there, but are there any ways we could additionally support the largest democracy in the world? Minister Goyal, welcome.
Thank you very much, Borje, and thank you, Ms. Ngozi, for your very encouraging remarks in this session, most of which resonates with all the countries in the world. Though I think you have a very difficult task ahead of you, reconciling the developed world's priorities and the developing and less developed countries' priorities. Also, the priorities of big business versus the small farmers, the small entrepreneurs. So it's going to be a tough navigation task at the WTO. And I can see that we have the right person in you to be able to take care of the situation. Thank you, Borje, for your very kind words about the prevailing situation and your concerns about the second wave that India is going through. Of course, yesterday I was reading Japan is going through the fourth wave now. Some countries have gone through 5 waves. And different parts of the world at different points of time have certainly seen this virus in very ugly forms. We, of course, have the added disadvantage of a very large population, a very dense population, especially in our cities and towns. And it's very redeeming when we get this support from all over the world. It clearly shows that the world recognizes that today we are fighting a common enemy. We may be divided by geographies, but the virus doesn't respect boundaries. And I believe that the second wave in almost all parts of the world has been much worse than the first wave. Rises rapidly, expands rapidly, affects more and more people. But when we did this scientific analysis, we found that the general age at which people are suffering, or the mortality rates, which in India generally have been lower than the rest of the world, are about the same as the first wave. So we continue to find older people affected much more. The middle ages also affected, but slightly less. Children, fortunately, less affected than the others. But it's clearly a challenging time for all of us in India. We appreciate the support that different countries have extended to us. We ourselves are ramping up production of oxygen, procurement of critical supplies, distribution of essential commodities across the country. We have used the Air Force, we've used seaplanes, we've used the seaways. Our railways is moving oxygen long distances. We are manufacturing pressure swing absorption plants to generate oxygen on mission mode. A lot of the measures we took in the last 1 year, preparing the nation for the second wave, are now coming to support the country in our fight. So simple case in point, India used to use less than 1,000 tons of liquid medical oxygen in the pre-COVID days. Even in the peak of the first wave of COVID, we barely used about 3,000 tons of liquid medical oxygen. Right now, we are using 9,000 tons of liquid medical oxygen. So for a developing nation to ramp up from under 1,000 to 9,000 in 1 year's time is, I would believe, been a very challenging task, but we have been able to meet by and large the requirements across the country. Sadly, some parts of the international media have given very exaggerated and very, very one-sided versions of the situation. It is, of course, a very tough time. I would not at all deny that. But it's not as if we are the only country which went through this. Even the developed world has seen, in some cases, much worse. We, with our resources, are working to face this pandemic with a lot of support, both within the country is standing as one, international support. We are ramping up our vaccination drive, the effort at the WTO to get technology for greater production of vaccination, for which we have huge capacity in India. And now with the United States also supporting it, I hope we can look at multilateral support and a consensus being developed quickly. Madam Ngozi, the speed is of the essence of this. If it takes months to negotiate a consensus or an agreement, or we do negotiate it and we don't get the raw materials for it, we are back to square one. So I think it'll have to be a holistic and comprehensive effort, as the countries around the world will all benefit with this. You can't live in isolation in this highly globalized world. Similarly, India is also working towards becoming an important stakeholder in resilient supply chains around the world. We have, in the peak of our first wave, and even now, continued to serve the world for whatever are our international commitments, both on trade in goods or in services, which we have a large contribution, particularly on the services side. We have met all our international obligations, and I assure you we will continue to do that in the months and years to come. Global solidarity, Borja, is the need of the hour. I'm sure with efforts such as the World Economic Forum, bringing all of us together on this platform today, and the global community's support, together our efforts will bear fruit, and we will be able to face this global challenge and emerge stronger at the end of the day. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Minister, and you can count on our support. And as you hear also from the world, I think we are all now looking at India, and we know that this is not a unique situation we've seen in other countries. We also have been through waves here in Europe, as you know. There's also been quite a discussion on access to vaccines and lifting also then a patent protection as part of this. So where do you stand on this discussion on lifting patent protection?
Borja, as you're aware, South Africa and India took the lead in presenting the proposal for a temporary and very focused, limited waiver of TRIPS for fighting the COVID pandemic. We had wanted to cover medicines, the cure whenever it comes up, the vaccination which is already available with large parts of the world, and the associated infrastructure to address the challenge of COVID. America has, of course, given a limited support for vaccines, which we heartily welcome. That is the pressing need of today. If we can vaccinate the entire world quickly, and India has huge capabilities, technical capacity, and skilled manpower, and we can actually help the world in ramping up vaccination very rapidly. And I do hope that this global collaborative effort and action that is currently being led by the WTO and Ms. Ngozi herself, will bear fruit, as I said earlier, not only in acceptance of the TRIPS waiver, but in expeditious consensus building, transfer of technology, availability of the molecules or all other raw materials to make this happen. And I hope that this will help us contribute in a bigger measure to overcome this crisis much faster. Over 100 countries have already supported it. And I'm sure the business world or those who are not yet on board will appreciate it is for everybody's good. It is not as if South Africa or India live in isolation of the rest of the world. When we will make vaccines, we will share it with the whole world. And we have sufficient large capacities to do it. And as you are aware, at one point of time, we gave out almost 67 million vaccines to less developed countries and developing countries, which probably nobody else did. I doubt any other developed country looked beyond their boundaries. But India, which believes in Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the world is one family, played the role of a responsible global citizen. Today we are facing a very severe crisis, a huge wave, therefore we are restrained to use our limited vaccines locally. But should this global effort succeed, I can assure you that India will be at the forefront, along with the rest of the world, in supporting the less developed countries and developing world. We believe that it is a collective effort and a joint responsibility of all countries in the world. And we will assure all our pharmaceutical companies and other developed countries also that we have always been intellectual property compliant and will continue to be so for all times to come. This current situation needs an extraordinary measure, and I'm sure we can all agree on extraordinary times requiring out-of-the-box solutions. Thank you.
No, thank you, Minister. We definitely are faced with force majeure. That's for sure. We discussed also with Director General Ngozi MC12 coming up. We know that India has always played a very important role in these MC10s or MC11s. What are the expectations for MC12 from India's side? And secondly, we also see that India is now embarking on some more regional trade agreements. There is a discussion now with the EU that has revived. We also have seen that you are in negotiations with the United Kingdom. At the same time, you were not part of this comprehensive economic partnership agreement in your region. So insight on MC12 and your ambitions there, and also your thinking around bilateral and regional trade agreements.
Thank you, Borje. Very, very relevant in the context of the future and the way trade lines are going to emerge going forward. At the outset on MC12, and I hope the Director General will take particular note of this, I personally have very, very serious concerns around the fact that the developed world manages to push its agenda into every ministerial that is held. And we land up only discussing areas of interest of the developed world, maybe given their clout in the entire global system. Whereas issues such as agricultural subsidies, a permanent solution to the public stockholding that was to be decided in so many years ago, the fact that we have to right size the way the Uruguay round gave a very raw deal in agriculture subsidies to the less developed and developing world, and in some sense froze our subsidies at that level, whereas the developed world continues to give out large subsidies because they were doing it many years ago also. So in some sense, this lopsided trading arrangements, subsidy arrangements, and benefits that the developed world is enjoying has to be addressed with more compassion, with more sincerity at the WTO. I think MC12 should focus on issues of the developing world and less developed countries to generate confidence in the rest of the world. That it's not about me, myself. It's about the holistic problems of the whole world that the WTO is concerned about. So it's going to be a tough task for Madam Ngozi. We will support her to the fullest as we have in the past, but certainly we cannot accept only the agenda of a limited set of countries, but the agenda of the entire world will have to be addressed fairly, equitably, and in the true spirit of the WTO, which was originally encompassed in their declarations. RCEP, Borje, was not a very balanced agreement, as it would have hurt India's farmers, our MSMEs, our dairy sector, and therefore it was prudent for India not to join the RCEP. And I'll tell you why I feel so. We already had free trade agreements with Japan, Korea, and 10 other ASEAN countries. That makes it 12. Australia and New Zealand are both vibrant democracies with which we can have a free trade agreement quite openly, easily. They are transparent economies. I can talk with them. I can understand their systems. I know what they tell me is what it is. And being democracies with transparent and rule-based systems, we can work with them. But unfortunately, all countries in RCEP were not of that nature. And we found that the kind of agreements that were being made, whether it was the rules of origin, which were very weak in my opinion, whether it was the ability to circumvent the opening up of different sectors by movement of goods from one geography to another, and then onwards to a third geography, where indirect and non-transparent subsidies could have hurt India. All of these factors weighed heavily on me when I took the call. Of course, the Honorable Prime Minister of India made the final decision in consultation with his entire team. But when India took the call that we will not join RCEP, it was a well-considered and balanced call, looking at the way the agreement was structured and considering that it did not really protect India's interests well or demonstrate integrity of purpose or transparency of and rules-based working in some geographies. Therefore, it was not possible for India to join that. With the UK, with the European Union, possibly going forward with Australia, with Canada, with the United States of America, these are countries with which we can resonate in terms of democracies, transparent, rule-based, multilateral engagement. There's always a court of law or an appeal to a higher authority if there is a problem. Investment flow is on both sides, which we need to protect. We are contributing significantly to these economies also. And our trade, by and large, is balanced. So with the US, with Canada, with the European Union, with UK, all these countries, we have a balanced trade. Our goods and services also have access, which they are willing to play by the rule book and play with transparency. And so are we. Therefore, we feel much more comfortable in launching negotiations for a balanced, ambitious, comprehensive, and mutually beneficial agreement on trade and investment protection. And with both these, the EU and the UK, we have both agreed to have very comprehensive dialogue, covering all streams, including sustainability and the likes. But to have one comprehensive dialogue, because very often the investment dialogue is mutually reinforcing to the trade dialogue. So while we'll work on parallel tracks, but we hope to conclude everything as one comprehensive, holistic vision, which will help people, businesses, and the economies on both sides of the agreement. So we are very excited about these negotiations and the potential they hold for economic growth and prosperity for the people of both India, the UK, and of course, all the countries of the EU. Thank you, Paul.
No, thank you so much, Minister Goyal, for joining us and also for all that insight. Before we go to the other panelists, I see you're still there, Madam Ngozi. Would you like to just shortly comment on what Minister Goyal said, also on the run-up to MC12?
Well, thank you, Borge. I would very quickly try to say a few things. I agree with a lot of what the Minister Goyal has said. First, on the issue of vaccines, I want to repeat that we need to give thanks to our members who were able to export outside India. There were three. India exported more than 40%, as I said in the beginning. China and the EU also exported, and we're very proud of that, that India was able to share when it had difficulties of its own. And of course, all our hearts go out to the struggles that are there, and I know that they will resolve very soon. On the issue of the speed, I totally agree with Minister Goyal. He's absolutely right. And you know, it's what I signaled at the beginning. There are times when we can't afford to take months and years to negotiate something. We're talking about lives being lost. So I'm hoping our members will come to the table quickly and start the discussions. I told that by July, I hope to see something and with a final outcome by MC12. And someone told me I was too ambitious. Yes, I'm very ambitious when there are lives. So this is my objective, to push members to work quickly and come to some agreement. On the issue of the ministerial and what Minister Goyal said, my hope is that we will be able to encompass agendas that are, you know, important to developing countries as well as developed. I agree with him on agriculture. I've talked to many of our members and they would be quite disappointed if we were not able to come to the table with some package on agriculture. And I very much like the food security angle that he talked about, because it's real. You know, we're experiencing it. And so we've been trying to persuade our members to look at the issue of public stock holding and making that permanent with all the transparency they would like to see. I'm sure that India has no problems with that. And so this is the way we are going. The WFP waiver, we've got to get that done. And domestic support, agricultural subsidies. I've got members from the Keynes group who are very insistent we look at this, other developing country members, because we're approaching $1 trillion in domestic support. And by 2030, it will be $2 trillion. If we don't start to talk about this and get a handle, you know, the same with industrial subsidies and support to SOEs as well. We also have that issue. But domestic subsidies are indeed a problem. It will be extremely tough. Let me end with that. I do agree with Minister Goyal that we have our work cut out for us because, you know, we still have deep divides. But guess what? I'm optimistic. We have to get it done. Just because, and I'm sure people like Professor Baldwin will speak to this when it comes. He's done a lot of work in this. We just need some successes for the WTO, and we just need to bridge our divides and bring some successes to the table. So we'll be working hard, and we'll be working with Minister Goyal. Thank you for your support.
No, thank you so much, Ngozi, and we're so pleased that you are ambitious, because a good start is having ambitions. And we also have seen that we were able to agree on trade facilitation agreement in 2013 in Bali. We even got an agreement in Nairobi on also phasing out export subsidies for agriculture. And as the Director General now underlined, maybe this COVID also has been a stark reminder to all of us that we have to look at it in a little bit of a different way when it comes to food security. So maybe with your leadership, we can break also some impasses there. Adrian, I have used a lot of time with the Minister and the Director General, but I think this was very, very useful. So I hope we can extend 5-10 minutes because we also will need to hear from the other extremely important voices.
Thank you so much, Børge. And we've heard a really exciting and dynamic vision from Dr. Ngozi about the role of the WTO in global trade, and also from Minister Goyal about government's priorities and needs in this conversation. But obviously, this trade structure is there to facilitate business itself. And it's great to be joined by two great leaders from the world of business, Hannadi Al-Saleh and Kiti Bose, and also by one of the leading scholars of global trade, Professor Richard Baldwin. I'm going to start, if I may, with you, Hannadi. Agility is a huge player in keeping the global logistics, the global supply chain structure moving. For big companies, we've seen that the COVID pandemic has presented problems, but they've been able to perhaps meet them with the kind of scale and resources that they have. How have SMEs and medium businesses fared, and what has a company like Agility been able to do to help them during this period?
First of all, thank you for inviting me to such a distinguished panel. And personally, I've already learned quite a great deal from the previous speaker's remarks. So I am the chairperson of Agility, a global logistics company. And from our experience in working with some of the world's biggest companies and tens of thousands of SMEs, as you rightly mentioned, there are two important themes that we see emerging from this pandemic, which will impact the future of trade and are strongly correlated to what the previous speakers have talked about, building resilient value chains and supply chains, and are also focused on inclusion as we touch on SMEs. The first theme is really around digital acceleration. This is not only the theme of the day, but the roadmap to our future growth. Today, everywhere you look, the supply chain is a mess. This was a recent sort of headline article in the Wall Street Journal, but in reality, this is exactly what you see on the ground. I don't want to understate the level of disruption that we're currently seeing. There's reduced air freight capacity, there's an ongoing shipping crisis. So if you actually look at sort of container rates, they are now 3 to 7 times higher than they were, at the same time last year. And that is even if you can get your container loaded onto a vessel. So the supply chain, what we find, is really imbalanced, and it has this knock-on effect in every sector and every size of business. So in this context, from our perspective, from the private sector, it's literally digital or die. Digitization of our business and the use of data in particular is driving resilience during this pandemic, and we expect it to drive resilience going forward. I'll give you an example. So the companies that can track shipments or inventory and orders are able to manage and communicate with their vendors is exactly where we see these businesses have an advantage, where they're able to see where there are shortages or where there are gluts of raw materials. This is going to position them for the future. We've seen digital acceleration and increased adoption across the board. And on average, from a recent McKinsey article, COVID has given companies a 3 to 4 year jump forward in digital. We are seeing this from all of our customers and including our SMEs. The second aspect that I'd like to talk about is e-commerce and how it's reshaping global trade. And a critical aspect of e-commerce is how it has a potential to make it more inclusive for SMEs and women. So cross-border e-commerce was the fastest growing segment of global trade pre-COVID. And e-commerce during that 1 year of COVID, has seen the equivalent of the growth of the past 10 years. And that's quite an interesting fact. And with e-commerce comes new opportunities for more inclusive trade, as I mentioned, for SMEs and women. This is a topic I'm personally extremely passionate about, and we as Agility have invested over $100 million in enabling and empowering SMEs and e-commerce logistics because we believe it's not only right, but it makes good business sense. Touching on SMEs, if you think about it, less than 30% of SMEs exported to mature markets in the past. But today, even a one-person company can become a multinational and participate in cross-border trade. And one of the results of the pandemic is that SMEs were disproportionately impacted. There is a new generation of small businesses which have come out of this, which are in the process of coming out of this crisis and moving their offline business to online in order to survive. And what you see around the world is governments are supporting these efforts, from digital reskilling and promoting SMEs, and it's actually part of their COVID-19 policy response. I'll give you an example of where I'm from, Kuwait. We have worked with our Kuwait National Fund in active campaigns to support SMEs and businesses and even supermarkets to move their businesses from the offline presence to online, which has been a critical success factor in enabling businesses. E-commerce has also created potential for economic opportunities for women around the world. Another example is in the Middle East. We have invested in a digital storefront called ExpandCart. Throughout the pandemic, it's onboarded hundreds of companies, and according to their statistics, 1/3 of the e-commerce businesses are owned by women. This is also echoed by World Economic Forum research, which talks about 1 out of 3 digital businesses in the Middle East is founded by a woman. I do think it is exciting times because digital is essentially democratizing trade. So just to recap, we do believe from the private sector, from our perspective as Agility, digital acceleration and e-commerce are reshaping global trade through this pandemic and beyond. And thank you.
Hanadi, thanks so much. I want to come back in a moment and ask you about sustainability, but you talked a lot there about e-commerce and opportunities, and it just seemed a natural place to bring in someone who's exactly in that space, which is Ankiti Bose. Ankiti, you're the co-founder and CEO of Zelingo. How has the pandemic kind of tested you and the business that you helped co-found?
Thank you so much, Adrian. I think just want to echo everything that Hanadi said, right? Every single aspect of the pandemic has forced digitization that would have happened over the next 4 or 5 years to happen in the last 12 or 15 months. So I'll probably move on to sort of what that means for our business, right? So we run a large B2B e-commerce platform that helps fashion and textile players source better and source directly from factories and so on. And in that, what we've seen is that over the last 14 months, there has been 3 to 5 times more digital adoption than what we would have expected pre-COVID. That's led to a far greater degree of cutting out middlemen or players in the value chain that were actually leaking value rather than adding value than before. It's led to an expansion of the way businesses think about their supply portfolio in terms of sort of how much exposure they have to manufacturers in China versus ASEAN versus South Asia versus say Latin America. And weigh all of these opportunities in terms of not just cost, but also transparency and the ability for them to actually think about important things like ESG. And one of the key takeaways for us has been that not just have we been able to drive great degree of digital adoption for textile and fashion brands across the world, actually, and of course we help them source primarily from ASEAN and South Asia because that's where we are based, but this is obviously a global trend, is that in freeing up the extra margins from removing middlemen because of digitization, there is now money on the table to invest in ESG. There is now money on the table to have, to be at least carbon neutral. Think about your carbon footprint. It's like historically, we have always made the argument that if we wanted to have ESG adopted today at a high, at any meaningful scale, then it would mean that it would be expensive in the present and it would reap us benefits in the mid to long term. That is no longer true because digitization has opened up these avenues that now let us invest in ESG, that now let us use transparent supply chains, that now have increased interoperability of systems in all of these, supply and demand countries that actually make this possible. So in the textile industry, for example, 5 to 10% more margin frees up for an average brand, mid-sized brand. If they go digital, they can see where the product was made, who made it in the factories, were there proper conditions for them to work for the labor, what were the products used, how much water was used or wasted, what are the fabrics that are used. And digital is obviously going to enable all of this. And I think that opens up very interesting opportunities into, where this money can be invested. And ESG is a key area where that can happen.
That's really interesting. One of the things that you mentioned there is the way that digitalization's opened up huge opportunities to kind of track things through supply chains. One of the problems that the pandemic's posed is it's cut travel completely and stop people interacting. So what about the physical aspects, the physical inspections of supply chains to make sure that those standards you talked about are really being adhered to? Are there alternatives that you and businesses like yours have found to dealing with those dimensions of the challenge on sustainability?
Absolutely. And I think, it was the necessity that drove that over the last few quarters. If you think about the entire textile supply chain, it's almost 5% of global GDP when you think about all the fabrics, raw materials, the people involved, and the final output. So obviously, this was a large industry that had historically always relied upon physical sampling, agents taking products from factories to representatives of brands in different countries. Very often national, international borders are crossed in this industry. And suddenly there was this need to do all of this digitally. And of course, it can't all happen with Zoom calls and so on, because, the specifics and the specs of something like textile is not quite as cut and dry as pharmaceuticals or electronics and so on. So what largely our industry is relying on is a ton of virtual sampling, virtual prototyping, and so on. And that doesn't mean that it's all, it's all happening on a screen, but we are essentially relying upon logistics networks and payments networks. And, again, what Inadi said really resonates strongly in this, such that a decision maker sitting in Prague or in London for a brand that's manufacturing in Vietnam and has to sell in the US, and the products have to end up, let's say, in an Amazon warehouse, FBA warehouse in the US, is able to do that such that our platform tracks the factory where the product was made. A logistic partner of a platform like ours would make sure that, say you are prototyping, sampling the prototype in Europe, you do that. And then the rest of the products are QC'd on digital platforms like ours and then shipped to the US to then further ship to the end consumer. So I think in the beginning, there was a lot of anxiety about how some of these things might turn up, but actually relying upon technology to certify products and ensure that they meet the exact standards, much more than relying on human intervention, has actually worked out fairly well in the textile industry. The overall industry is still trending somewhere, I would say 15 to 18% lower in terms of sales than pre-COVID times. But the shift to digital, for example, has been huge. Like over $100 billion of end demand has moved towards online channels. So there's just so much greater adoption of technology that we actually think these are some irreversible shifts. Post-pandemic, people are not going to go back to relying on human intervention or human certification as much as they now rely on APIs and tracking platforms.
And Kirti, thanks so much. It's really great to kind of have those very practical, very real examples of the kind of macro issues that we've been talking about. As I mentioned, I just want to return to Hanadi in a second, but first, great to see Dan Tehan, Minister of Trade, Tourism and Investment in Australia, joining us. Thanks so much for coming online. We're able just to overrun, Dan, if you can stay with us an extra 10 minutes. Richard Baldwin, I mean, there's probably no aspect of this discussion that we couldn't explore with your help. You've studied so many different dimensions of trade. But one of the most fascinating things about your work is really identifying some of the new areas that we've seen accelerated by COVID, which is suddenly people have had to stop moving around. And the global trade in services that you've pointed at as being one of the phenomenal kind of issues of the fourth industrial revolution. How have we seen that accelerate? And what are some of your observations just listening to this discussion?
Well, I think just to start, I get to be the theoretical one here. So just to start a little bit theoretical, I view globalization as arbitrage. And one of the biggest differences around the world are salaries and wage rates. And arbitrage on those has been hindered by the very high cost of getting people face to face. And what this digital technology is doing is making remote people less remote. And what COVID has done is, and Kika and Hanada pointed out, is accelerated the whole thing. It hasn't changed the course, it's just made it faster. So we're going to a world where it's much easier for people to sit in one country and work in offices in another. And that's sort of a huge trend. You can see it. It's a little hard to find real-time data in trade. It's official data is way behind. But on things like freelance platforms, you see a huge boom in the amount of stuff that's being provided. And of course, we know domestically it's happened in an enormous way, how many people are working from home. And working from home is really just the first step to getting an organization in a position where they could also hire some people, or at least for some of those tasks, abroad for much less. And so that kind of opportunity is really expanding very rapidly. So that's where I would say where we're going. If I could take 2 seconds, I can't help but react to this COVID vaccine thing, which the political leaders were talking about, Ngozi and the Indian minister. I mean, I think this is a huge opportunity to demonstrate that trade is working to help save lives and make the world better off. Moreover, I think it's been a wake-up call. In COVID, we now all understand until it's over everywhere, it's over nowhere. And the same sort of thing is coming on climate. And as Dr. Ngozi said, on food stocks, food security, all these issues which we kind of took as given and safe, COVID has sort of alerted us to it. And now with the great digitization, I think it's also is leading to another connection. So thank you very much for having me and letting me share my talks there, Adrian. I don't even know if I answered your question, but.
Well, as I think I said in introducing you, there's probably no dimension of this discussion that you couldn't say something interesting about, Richard. And it's just great to have you as part of our discussion, because, you know, your insights always kind of shine a light on these trade discussions. Hannadi, can I briefly, just before turning over to Børge and Minister Tian, just ask about sustainability and how Agility is dealing with that? We heard from Ankiti about some of the ways they're using digitalization to kind of help demonstrate that. How are you dealing with that in Agility? Because you handle so much of the world's trade.
Yeah, so from our perspective, I think it's, we as Agility have put it at the forefront and a critical priority starting several years ago. I mean, so far we've invested over $100 million in the area of sustainability and ESG. From our perspective, we've listened to our customers, we understand the changes in regulation, and we're making this a top priority in various areas. So if I think about technological innovation, we're extremely focused in investing in our supply chains. For example, we've invested in a company like Hyliion, which is looking to turn existing trucking fleets into zero-emission fleets, which for us is extremely critical for both the environment and then listening to our customers. You know, most of our customers in the RFPs have mandates and requirements to push us, to look at, reducing CO2 emissions. Not just that, we give our customers and we invest in our business in ensuring we give them visibility. Literally today, there's nowhere to hide. 70% of shippers, actually 75% of shippers look at sustainability as part of their RFQs. So they want to know about fuel efficiency, CO2 emissions, alternative fuel use. And this is where we as a business have a core team dedicated to that investment in order to, have an ethical investment and also provide these solutions to support the business that we deal with.
Thanks so much, Hannadi. And just to close up our discussion, I want to bring things back to government and Børge to introduce Minister Tian from Australia.
Thank you, Adrian, and thanks to the panelists for great contributions. I think we're all much more enlightened after this discussion, and it's very timely then to also have the Minister for Trade, Investments and Tourism from Australia with us. Dan Tian, great to see you. We know it's pretty late there in Australia. Before you were able to join us, we had Minister Goyal and Dr. Ngozi, and they both underlined that there will be no recovery without a trade recovery. They also went into real discussions about what could be possible outcomes of the MC12 here in Geneva in December. they underlined technology governance related to technology companies. We also touched on the dispute settlement mechanism. We already touched on then lifting protection of patents. That discussion has been going on the last weeks, but it's a force majeure. But we know there are very interesting also discussions now around investment facilitation, the green components moving forward, and the whole e-commerce piece. We know that Australia has traditionally played a very important role in the WTO, has been a great supporter of WTO, but we haven't really delivered anything major in 20 years. So what are your contributions and what are your aspirations for MC12? Over to you, Minister, and welcome.
Yeah, thank you. And it's a pleasure to join you this evening here in Australia. And I must say, I don't think there's never been a more important time for us to get the focus back on the World Trade Organisation and make sure that it can deliver not only in ensuring that we can continue to improve our trade rules, but also ensuring that the countries adhere to the trade rules. That's how we saw such positive economic growth post the Second World War. And as we come out of this pandemic, I don't think it's ever been more important to send that positive message that trade liberalisation will help countries grow out of this pandemic. And it can do that on a number of fronts. If we look, for instance, in trade in health and the discussion around vaccines, can I commend the Director General of the World Trade Organisation for the leadership role that she's played in bringing everyone together. Everyone thought that this was a very hard issue to deal with. She had the courage to take it on, and I think what we've seen is a willingness of all countries to come together now and to compromise on a number of areas. And my hope is that we will be able to get a trade and health outcome because of the leadership she's shown. We've seen the US prepared to move when it comes to a TRIPS waiver, which we welcome. We think that that's a positive leadership. And if we can see other countries come to the table in the same spirit, with the focus being on making sure that we can improve the quantity of vaccines that we are producing globally, then the World Trade Organisation will have shown that it can play a role in the global world as we come out of this pandemic. And my hope is that we'll be able to continue to make progress on this. I spoke with the South African minister last week on this very issue, and they are keen to engage. I know the Indian government is also keen to engage. If we can get the European Union and others playing a similar role, I think we can get a real outcome which in the end will deliver more vaccines to more countries. And Australia is trying to play a leadership role here. I've obviously met and discussed on 2 occasions the role that Australia can play in helping the Director General of the World Trade Organisation in this area. And we're trying to lead by example. We are also exporting vaccines that we've manufactured here in Australia to our region. And our hope is that we'll continue to be able to do that and grow the number of vaccines that we're being able to deliver for our region. Well, I think there is potential when it comes to fishery subsidies, and it was great to see that there's a new text which has come out on fishery subsidies. Once again, at the ministerial meeting in July, if we could get an outcome on fishery subsidies, this is something the WTO has been dealing with now for a number of years. And if we could show that as we're coming out of this pandemic, we're all prepared to compromise to get an outcome on fishery subsidies, big tick again for the World Trade Organisation, then we can begin to look at other issues that we know need addressing. Agriculture is one of them, and as the convener of the Cairns Group, this is something that we will continue to put on the table because it is an issue that the World Trade Organisation has been trying to deal with for a number of years, and we think that it's an essential part of any deal that will be required at the ministerial meeting at the end of the year. Also, we will need to see some progress on some of the JSIs, and in particular when it comes to e-commerce, digital trade. We think through the great work that Australia, Singapore and Japan have been able to do, that we can deliver an outcome at MC12 on this important issue. And if the World Trade Organisation is going to be able to deliver for the world as it is now. Obviously, e-commerce or digital trade is such an important aspect that we have to be able to put rules in place to deliver when it comes to e-commerce. And I think that we can do that as well. When it comes to services domestic regulation also, there is another real opportunity there for us to deliver. And if we can get countries coming together with the right spirit, we'll be able to get an outcome. So I'm very optimistic that we can have the World Trade Organization delivering like it used to 20 odd years ago, if we all come together with the right spirit, and if we can support the new Director General and the role that she's playing, the enthusiasm she's bringing, her idea of bringing everyone together, seeking consensus and getting outcomes, that we can do that. And I can tell you Australia stands ready and willing to play a leadership role in helping the Director General on her big task, but incredibly important task.
Well, thank you so much, Minister, also for Australia's leadership in this. And as you rightly alluded to, I think the discussion on the fishery subsidies, abolishing them, has been going on for now 20 years. And in the environmental context, to subsidize fisheries when we know there are some fish stocks that are also already almost depleted is a topic that we should put on the agenda. So let's see if one can work miracles now in July here in Geneva. But talking about miracles, Australia has also done extremely well in handling the pandemic. Of course, some people would say it is easier when you're a big continent like yourself. It's easier then to also take the necessary measures. But regardless, COVID is handled in a way that there are very, very few cases. A few of the variants have been spreading. At the same time, the vaccination is not rolled out in the same way as in other countries, but it hasn't been such a need immediately either, due to the fact there is very little spread. But you also have another hat on you. As I mentioned, you're not only trade minister, but you're investment minister, but also tourism minister. And we know tourism has traditionally played an important role also in Australia. Could you shortly share with us how you see the gradual opening up of your economy? I guess what we have seen in India now the last weeks have made you even more cautious. But how is your reopening map moving forward?
So to start with, one of the things that we have encouraged while we haven't been able to travel internationally is to make sure that Australians travel within our great nation and explore the wonderful sites that we have. And we've seen Australians do that en masse, and that has really helped our domestic tourism industry. So that has been one of the huge advantages that we've had, is that we've really encouraged Australians to capitalise on their ability, rather than going overseas, to travel within our great country and see the wonderful sites, the Great Barrier Reef, the 12 Apostles, Ayers Rock. There are so many wonderful places to go and see, and that's been one of the real benefits due to the fact that the border's been closed. But we've also started to look where we can safely open up. So we now have a travel bubble with New Zealand. So we've got New Zealanders travelling to Australia and Australians travelling to New Zealand, and that is working well. And the next task for us to do will be to see where else we can open up. And I think what we'll be looking to is to see if we continue down the travel bubble path. So one of the countries that we've been in some conversations with is Singapore. They've obviously done a very good job in dealing with the pandemic as well. So Singapore down the track is another potential bubble for us. Or there might be some places in the Pacific as well where they've also done very well in dealing with COVID-19. Along with that, and looking at bubbles, we're also looking at rolling out our vaccine program as well, and that's starting to make real progress. 400,000 people were vaccinated last week. We've now vaccinated over 2.5 million people. So that's about 10% of our population. And as we've seen in other countries, once you get your vaccination program rolling out, it tends to step up quite considerably. And as long as we can continue to get access to the supply of the vaccines that we need, we're confident that our vaccine program will gear up and continue apace up until now and the end of the year. So in terms of how we open up, we'll look at other countries and where we get the medical advice which says it's safe to do so, then we'll look at other bubbles. But one of the keys to our success has been listening to the medical advice. And in the end, that will be what will drive our policy in opening up our borders.
Well, thank you so much, Minister. Thank you also to the other panelists. This has been very, very, in my view, interesting session. And your last reminder, I think, is something that we can all agree on, is it's been a renaissance for scientists. We should listen more to scientists also as a basis for political decisions moving forward. I think there is also new momentum on the trade negotiations under Ngosi's able leadership. We hopefully will also have a new buy-in from developing countries and emerging economies together with the developed economies. So thank you so much to all of you. Thank you, Adrian, for being my co-pilot here.
Pleasure, my pleasure. And if you want to catch any of this discussion, we'll be sharing the highlights online on any of our social channels, but also you can go to the web, go to weforum.org, and you'll find the video of this agenda dialogue there. Thanks to everyone once again from me. Thanks to all of you for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you at the next agenda dialogue. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks and well done.